Hello and welcome back to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. Let's paint loose today. Join me in the studio while I show you how I painted this really loose and atmospheric landscape painting. I'll be using big brushes and a few colours and keeping it really simple. But just before the demo, a quick plug for my book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner. It's available to purchase from all good bookstores and there's a couple of links in the description below. And also Morgana and I have our new book. It's out very soon, Flowers in Watercolour, and we hope that you'll follow the links below to take a look at that. Right, let's get on with the demo. Here's the outline in pencil. I've penciled in the scene very lightly. Pause the screen here if you want to take a closer look. I'm using Canson Moulin de Roy cold pressed watercolour paper. It's taped to my board with ordinary decorator's masking tape and my board at an angle of about 20 degrees. I'm using a large wash brush. In this case it's a Princeton Aqua Elite 1.5 inch modeler brush, and I'm wetting the sky all over and I'm wetting around the foreground, leaving a few dry patches here and there. This is cobalt blue with a little bit of cerulean blue added. I'm working around some cloud shapes with this mid-value paint. Of course, I'm painting wet into the wet paper. You can see things softening and diffusing and giving me the suggestion of clouds quite quickly. And that's what's so lovely about the wet in wet technique. It takes a bit of practice, but it's a wonderful technique for creating very light, airy skies in a very simple way without any sort of fuss. So that's my sky just about done. A little bit of the same colour with a touch of indigo added to the blue to start off the water. I'm going to go straight in with really dark perylene green. This is almost tube consistency perylene green with a little bit of water added. And I'm just using the tips of the brush to create the suggestion of a stand of pine trees over here on the left. Just bringing those trees down, making sure they get a little bit wider as they come to the lake shore. And now I've dipped into sap green with some raw sienna, and I'm putting in the trees on my far bank, which are some sort of autumnal deciduous trees. You can see that I've got a little bit of orange going on there for autumn colour. That's from dipping straight into burnt sienna along with the other colours that are on my brush. Because the page is still wet, things are softening and diffusing. And this is giving me the illusion of this riverbank or lake bank with the sort of trees going off into the distance. Now I've mixed my sap green mixture with more of that dark perylene green to paint some closer foreground trees over here on the right. Keeping that paint nice and rich, but as you can see with all of my brushwork, keeping it very minimal, very simple, just using the brushwork to suggest the scene. I've cleaned my brush and dipped back into the sky colour and just continuing down with the lake and then dipping into that green colour and swiping the brush along for the foreground into the damp paper, and then dipping into some sepia, a little bit of indigo for a bit of dark. And this is something and nothing for the foreground. I'm just allowing the paint to create the illusion of sort of this marshy ground, leaving a little bit of unpainted paper in the foreground as well, because I can paint some water into that to sort of continue the illusion of this marshy ground. This is my palette knife and I'm scraping through the rich paint. I'm drawing with it really to create tree trunks and branches, just lifting them really loosely out of this rich paint. If you're not keen on this technique, then leave your painting to dry completely, and when it's dry, put in tree trunks and branches using a rigger brush. I've dipped into some indigo and the perylene green, just a nice dark colour, and putting in a bit of shadow, and that shadow softening and diffusing into and around the trees. And now just running a clean damp flat brush across the water to lift out maybe a few highlights here and there. Just keep things nice and flat so that the water has a sort of a convincing but loose look to it. Now I'm using a piece of paper tissue and drying up the tape around the base so that I don't get any paint or water leaking in and creating sort of unsightly marks as it dries. Then just back to scrape a few sort of finer marks with the palette knife for those sort of finer sticks and twigs. I will work around those with paint and a rigger brush a bit later on once it's dry, but for now I'm just going to be putting in some grasses in the foreground as well, or the illusion of grasses. Not too many, but just enough to give that kind of sort of unkempt natural look to the foreground. And that's it for this stage. I'm now going to leave it to dry completely. So here's the dry painting. It's looking nice and loose, nice and simple, and it hasn't taken very long to get this far. But just a few finishing touches just to bring it together a little bit more. I'm using a small calligraphy brush and I've dipped into a rich dark value mixture of my perylene green. And I'm just going to dot on a few little marks, sort of calligraphic brush marks, over my stand of pine trees, just to bring a little bit of definition to their shape around the edges. And now I've moved over to these trees here on the right, and I've mixed up a bit of sepia, and I'm going to work around the tree trunks and branches that I scraped in earlier, adding in some nice dark branches and twigs, and then I'll dip into sap green and burnt sienna and a bit of perylene green, and add a few clusters of loose autumn leaves to this slightly nearer tree, just to add a bit of definition on this side. And just a finishing touch, using the flat brush to dash a little bit of the sky colour, cobalt blue, across the foreground, just to look like the sky reflecting in the marshy puddles in the foreground. And I think I'm happy with that overall. I think the painting is really loose. There's just enough definition to bring the painting together, but it's a nice I think, straightforward painting for beginners to have a go at. Don't worry if you don't get it first time. Keep trying, because it's building confidence in this sort of loose brushwork and water control in your paint, your paper and your brushes that takes the time with watercolour painting. But if you sort of keep practicing, you'll get there. And with big brushes and loose brushwork, I think you'll find that you'll really begin to enjoy the process of painting these really loose and lovely scenes. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the demo, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel, then I'll invite you to do so. It's free to do, and it really does help with our reach. And if you'd like to support the channel, then hop over to Patreon and you can support us there, and you can also access exclusive content. Many thanks again. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.